Welcome to Talking to Grandma, a weekly podcast about raising and teaching bilingual and multilingual kids. I'm Jenn Vargas-Pressman, educator, mother, and advocate for bilingualism in our communities. Whether you're a parent, grandparent, teacher, or just someone who cares about language and culture, this podcast is for you. Together with our guests, we'll explore how to support bilingualism in ways that affirm identity and strengthen community. Today, we hear from Dr. Andrew Hernández, a Boricua, Puerto Rican educator who grew up near Chicago. After living and working in New York City, several West African countries, and New Zealand, Andrew settled in Colorado, where he taught literacy and special education before becoming a building administrator at a dual language school. He is also a proud dad raising a bilingual daughter.
Parent the kid you have, not the kid that you expected or the kid you anticipated or the kid that was written about in the parenting book that you picked up. Like, parent the child you have and be responsive to them.
In this episode, Andrew shares how his journey as a heritage language speaker shaped his view of raising a bilingual daughter. We dig into practical methods, building kid agency without losing family goals, and finding culture right where you live. Andrew also offers straight talk for families in dual language programs, what the elementary literacy dip really means, how schools can support parents, and ways to keep teens engaged by tying language to their real interests. If you need a reminder to give yourself grace on your bilingual parenting journey, this one's for you. Welcome, bienvenidos a Dr. Andrew Hernández. We're so glad to have you. Thank you so much for being on the Talking to Grandma podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me. This is exciting.
Yes, of course. To kick us off, we're going to get kind of deep and we're going to talk about your experience both as an educator and as a parent within the bilingual realm. And I just want to start us off with learning a little bit more about you. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience with either language loss or language preservation?
That's a complicated story. Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I think I've always been interested in language loss and language recovery, affirming language, etc. And I think a lot of it is rooted in my own experience. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago that was incredibly assimilationist. Very few brown people lived there, very few people of color. So predominantly white. And especially back in that time, I'd like to think it's better now, but especially then, there really wasn't a lot of space created to affirm non-white cultures and languages other than English. And so there was a lot of pressure growing up to speak English. And that came from outside the home as well as from inside the home. I think typical to a lot of immigrant experiences, my parents had kind of adopted this, like, we're in the States now and we speak English now. And they were really worried about me or my younger brother speaking accented English, whatever that is, right? Everything has an accent. But what I also found really interesting, and I didn't really understand this pressure that my parents were under when I was a kid. It was only subsequent to talking to them as I grew up. Some of the pressures to speak English also came from pressures to speak, quote, unaccented Spanish. My father in particular grew up, his parents grew up in a very rural, low income, low education part of Puerto Rico. So he always said he grew up speaking what they call Jíbaro or hillbilly Spanish. And he really didn't want me speaking Spanish with that accent because he was worried that I would experience some of the same prejudices that he did from fellow Spanish speakers, and including, other English speakers. So that was a very long-winded way of saying I grew up in a very assimilationist environment where, like I think a lot of immigrant kids, they grew up listening to the heritage language when they were at abuela's house, right? And they understood to some degree what the elders were saying, but always responding in English. And as elder passed on, or in my case, Puerto Rico being part of the United States, a lot of my family retired and went back. As that shift happened, there was less and less Spanish happening. I think I'd always been interested in really recovering that as I got older, because being English only or this white passing identity that was being thrust upon me never really felt right or authentic. But really, when I became a parent, I was like, I am not doing this. I didn't want my daughter to experience the same kinds of tensions that I did growing up. And so, it was one of those things like for all the parents out there, like you have certain ideas of, what you're going to be or who you're going to be as a parent. And some of that is really wishful thinking. Right? And then you have your kid and you're like, oh, that was never going to happen. Right. But the language and the cultural piece was really, really affirmed. The minute that she was born, I was like, okay, no, like this is what we're going to do.
That's great. No, and I totally agree. Right. We go into it with best intentions. And I think I'm not sure about you. I was an educator right before I was a parent, and you're like, oh, right. Like best laid plans, right? This is what we always do. Backwards planning. This is my intention. So this is what I have to do. Right. And then the kid comes along and you're like, oh, that doesn't seem like it's going to work out exactly how I pictured it.
Well, exactly. And I read the books about how to raise a bilingual kid and all of that. And, the books never talk about how and you're doing that with 3 hours of sleep or whatever, So it's like, cool. Like this sounds great in theory, but yeah, it's real too.
It is real, which actually brings me to the next question. I'd love to know more, right, about the intricacies of your journey in my multilingual parenting, right? Like maybe some lessons you've learned so far or some successes, or even if you want to share some of those, like, ooh, wish I could have done that differently.
Yeah. Oh man, the amount of do-overs that we want as parents, right? Well, I think the first lesson, before even skipping to directly answering your question, I think the first thing that I really started to take to heart as a parent was this is a long game. It's so stereotypical to be like, oh, it's a marathon, not a sprint, but it really is, right? I think one of the things that I learned, and this isn't directly related to bilingual parenting or heritage maintenance, et cetera, but just kind of parenting in general, is you have to give yourself grace. My daughter is about to turn 6. She's still acquiring language. She's acquiring, in this case, 2 languages. She will continue to acquire 2 or more languages as she grows up. And so if something that I do or that my partner does on a given day just doesn't land, it is okay. We have tomorrow, right?
Yep.
One decision that I make one day isn't going to be like, oh no, now she's never going to be bilingual, right?
Right.
But I think there's a lot of pressure, again, in parenting in general. And I think in bilingual parenting specifically to always get it right. And that was something that I had to learn to be the kind of dad that I wanted. I had to take that pressure off of me because, and this is something that my partner also helped me with, she was like, you're putting so much pressure on yourself to be this bilingual parent for our kid. And it's, you're also that's only one part of parenting though, and there's all this other stuff that I know you want to show up in that way. Mm-hmm. And the amount of pressure you're putting on yourself in this one little area, not little, big area, right? But in this one area is impacting other parts of your parenting. So I really learned to give myself grace when it came to raising a child to speak a language that is not the dominant language of the United States, right? Or at least this part of the United States. So to rewind a little bit and go back and actually answer your question, I think, there's a lot of different models, around bilingual parenting. There's the kind of a full-on, in this case, Spanish, right? Spanish immersion. My partner does speak Spanish. It's not her first language, but she's fluent. So we had talked about are we just going to always speak Spanish in the house and, and do that for our child? But we realized the language of our relationship is English. And while that might, we don't even know, that might have given our child something, it would have taken something away from our relationship. And to do right by our child, we have to do right by ourselves as well. Mm-hmm. And so we decided pretty early on, we're not just going to be a Spanish immersion household. So instead, we really went to another model, which was more, I'll speak a lot of Spanish and my partner will speak a lot of English. And sometimes we'll switch. Through that, hopefully our daughter will acquire both Spanish and English. We're supplementing that by, she was going to a Spanish immersion daycare from when she was 1 year old. And then she's been in a dual language Spanish immersion school where I'm privileged enough to be the assistant principal. And she's been in that since ECE, early childhood education year. So she's getting a lot of Spanish immersion at school as well. And I mean, I recognize that that's a privileged position for my family to be in. Not everyone can afford daycare, and these dual language spots are competitive. And so that's not a model that everyone is going to have access to, unfortunately. But it was the model that we were able to create for our family.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating that you mentioned about the different models that are out there, and that's often such a question that comes up, like, which is the best model? And there's no there's no one right model, right? It really depends on what works for the family and what works for the dynamics. And like maybe even something that works when they're younger may not work when they're older, right? Like, and so it goes back to your statement of having grace, right? And being like, okay, like this is an evolution, right? And we got to stay fluid in it as long as like we're checking in with our goals. But like, like you're saying, the pressure can feel so real, right? And sometimes we feel like such high stakes, right? We're like, we want to raise our children bilingually, that it does sometimes make us forget, I guess, of the other aspects of parenting. And someone mentioned in a conversation about how while raising their child biculturally is really important, that at the end of the day, what is most important is the connection, right, between them and their child. And so if that, right, like if that language becomes one of their ways of connection, wonderful, right? And like how beautiful that is that, but to not trump a connection just to have this idea of like, I'm raising you bilingually, right? Because as we know, when we force kids to do something, they just want to resist it anyways.
So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And a couple of things are popping to mind right now. The first is like, I feel like so many of these models around bilingual parenting don't take into account the child's own agency. And my daughter, she loves to take my partners and my parenting advice, manipulate it and put it right back in our face, repackage it and make it her own. And her bilingual journey is following a fairly common trajectory of understands 100% of Spanish and English, commonly responds in English, will talk in Spanish with her teachers because that has become a Spanish-speaking space for her, given that it's a Spanish immersion program. But she learned very early on that home is an English space, and she doesn't always want to speak Spanish at home. And so I remember, now that she's almost 6, we part of our parenting philosophy, we talk a lot about you have to have, ask for permission, consent, those kinds of themes. And so we're in the car and I start talking to her in Spanish, and she just like looks at me through the rearview mirror and she's like, "Dad, you did not ask permission to speak to me in Spanish." And I just couldn't believe it. It was really on brand for my kid. So then I go down this whole diatribe about like, well, like it's important to be bilingual and this is our heritage language. And also that's not exactly what I mean when I'm talking about consent. And if I want to speak my heritage language, I can. All of that. She actually probably understood most of it, but she pretended that it went over her head. And she was just like giving me this really indignant face through the mirror and like, "No, we're doing English now." I'm like, "Well, all right, if you say so." So I think, right, like you have to, the best piece of parenting advice that I think I received, and again, this is not specific to bilingual parenting, just parenting in general but parent the kid you have, not the kid that you expected or the kid you anticipated or the kid that was written about in the parenting book that you picked up. Like parent the child you have and be responsive to them. And so, we have a kid who's very, very independent and knows what she wants. And so, that doesn't mean that our values are going away, but, it's finding like how our values of bilingualism and biculturalism going to fit with a child who, now that she's 6, is realizing that Spanish might be harder or Spanish isn't the dominant language and I want to speak the dominant language. And so that resistance that is all too common, how do we parent given that? And I'm finding like the best way to do that is I talk to her. My partner talks to her. We justify why we're speaking in Spanish at a given time, why we're doing English at others, why she learns Spanish at school. But the other thing that I realized, and this is what I was like, it's so obvious, but like now that she's older, I'm like, we can actually give her a little more structure around language. And I think one of the pieces of bilingual parenting advice that I would resist is this sort of like tiptoe around your kid when it comes to language, because you don't want to turn your language, or you don't want to turn your kid off to your language. It's kind of like a message that I perceived from some of these bilingual parenting books. And I think that might be the case for some kids. That might be the case when they're younger. But now that my daughter is entering first grade, she's old enough that, like, if we're speaking in Spanish and she's responding to me in English, I can just tell her, like, let's try that again in Spanish. And she's like, oh, okay. And she will, right? Like, but again, I think some of the parenting advice would have you think that you could never actually, like, quote, correct your kid to use a different language because, like, oh, it'll come naturally, so they say. I don't know, like, English is a pretty strong influence, and sometimes a kid just needs to be told directly, like, no, like, we're doing this in Spanish now. And so something else that we've implemented just this summer in our household is we schedule when we're going to talk in Spanish. Like, okay, like, from this, for this hour, it's kind of leading up to dinner. And that's for us, that works because I do a lot of the cooking and my daughter likes to help, so it's a time that the two of us are together anyway. And okay, for this hour, when we're in the kitchen together, we are doing it in Spanish. And now she just knows that's the expectation and she's responding. We can be more direct as parents, I think, in different circumstances.
And, what I'm hearing you say also is that, like, we have to be truthful with ourselves and what we're capable of doing, right? Like our capacities as parents, and so to say, like, of course, in an ideal world, I wish I could remember to speak Spanish all day, every day, right? And it doesn't happen that way. And so, like, how can we be like, okay, well, I know, right, that if we're together during cooking time, that this is a good amount of time. And if we commit to this, right, if you commit to something, one, she knows what to expect. Two, like, it's an accountability piece for you because she's going to start wanting it also, right? Like, that's your guys' bonding time. It's a connection time in Spanish. And then when, like, all the science based on habit forming is that, like, once you develop that habit and it feels more automatic, it's easier to add on, right? And so I think that, like, as parents in general, like you've been mentioning a lot, as parents in general, and then also like an added burden of or weight or sense of responsibility in trying to raise your child bilingually is that, like, we try to go, like, do it all,
Yes.
And I mean, and I think that that's where we get, like, parent burnout. And then that's where we're like, oh, we're such failures. But it's like, because we're trying to meet these ridiculous expectations. And, I think that often that could lead to, and I'm not sure if you've seen this, within your parent groups or even within the families at your school, like, where they're like, parents are like, I give up. I couldn't do it. It didn't work. Right. Then there's a lot of, like, defeatist, feelings. So, I appreciate hearing you say that, right? Like, we've committed to this, right? Because this is what works right now. And it doesn't mean it's forever. It means, like, right now, this is what we're committing to. And
I'm really glad that you mentioned that because it also, it makes me think about what I was talking about, grace before, like, again, not just grace in terms of parenting, but grace for ourselves as parents. And what I mean by that, like, this took me a long time to admit, and maybe I'm the only one. I doubt it. But, we have this term heritage speaker, right? But that single term does not capture all of the experiences that come with being a heritage speaker. Due to my own, I guess, internalized authenticity politics, stuff that I'm grappling with, I really don't like admitting that it is easier for me to speak and think in English. Given my upbringing, given everything, like, I don't like owning that. I think there's a lot of heritage speakers out there who are like, we are going to do 100% Spanish immersion. That's exhausting if that's not your dominant language. And so after a long day, you're coming home and, like, your brain might just not be up for it, or emotionally you might not be up for it. And that is okay. And that was another source of pressure that I was putting on myself, that I didn't want to own that, like, this is work for my kid. This is work for me too. And sometimes like, I need rest, right? My brain needs that linguistic rest. I think another source of pressure that a lot of heritage families put on themselves is, you mentioned connection by, earlier you mentioned biculturalism. And I think there's this notion that cultural connection always or only exists over there, like where the elders came from. And so there's this pressure to go back as much as you can.
Right.
And that's the only way that your child is going to have access to the heritage culture. I mean, talk about pressure, right? Like that's expensive. That's a privileged position to be in. It might not be politically possible for a number of people for whatever reason. Or like, another thing that is hard for me to admit is like, I love Puerto Rico. I don't want to go back to Puerto Rico 2 times a year. I want to explore the world. Like I want to, I want to make that available to my kid, and I want her to know other places too. I want to see other places too, and so we can both and it. And one of the ways that we can do that is legitimize the cultural connections that exist within our very own communities. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also like in doing that, that's also resisting the very assimilationist mindset that reproduces English dominance. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, no, like we don't have to be in this monolithic space. We don't have to acknowledge or cultivate that. Like there are communities and pockets and systems and structures that, cultivate heritage, culture, and language everywhere. And we can lean into that, next door. And that's equivalently legitimate as like going back to like great uncle's house on the island.
Right. When you mention that, like that cultural connection only exists there, like only exists, back at the source country, right? Like, but I think, that is also, in a way, it's like, it can feel for families, I think, disempowering, right? That I can't create what I want with the values that I have and I want for my family here, right? That is reliance on something external. And exactly. So like, I'm curious, like with that kind of recognition, like, kind of what other practices do you have with your kiddo and within your family dynamic, right? Where you are seeking out or finding opportunities to kind of bring in those values of culture and language, within the household as another way to support, raising your child bilingually?
That's a great question. I resist what I call the ethnic aisle, like cultural connection, like food in so many ways, the kitchen and food and breaking bread together, like that communal connection is one place where culture, is reproduced, right? And that those values that are so important and, to my family and so important to so many others, are reproduced. But it is so much more than like, okay, yeah, I have Goya in my kitchen. Cool. But it's so much more than that.
Right.
I think immigrant families sometimes, especially once you get into second and third generation, we get really spread out or can. And so I think one thing that we really try to do in my family is to bridge the distance, whether that be virtually or through different kinds of events, holidays, etc. One thing that has become really, as much as I just criticize the ethnic food aisle, one thing that has become really, really important to us is we have our annual pasteles making thing. For those of you who don't know, pasteles are, I guess, like Puerto Rican tamales, just made with lots of root vegetables and plantains for the masa instead of corn, and traditionally wrapped in banana leaves, but usually wrapped in foil, because who has time for that? And it's so that's something that we've started to do. That is, it's both about the food, and then that is something that we do eat over the holidays, and it's something that marks us in a special way. But it's also clearly about everything beside the food. It's about the connection. It's about coming together, telling and retelling the same stories about the same people, and it doesn't matter that we all know the stories, but we're going to retell them and just like bring that to life. And then we're going to teach it to the next generation. And so I think that's one way as well. And I guess I just kind of mentioned another is just storytelling is, and that's such an informal and relatively easy way to build that connection. And that's something that we can just do within our family of, either getting books from the library or just like telling stories about, abuelo, abuela, etc., and like, this is who they are. This is what the island is like in my case, right? And just making it come alive, even if it's not a place that we're visiting every summer,
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to
oh, please, no,
add to that, or to just piggyback on that I love that you kind of paired, right? I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Denver Public Library system here. And, as an educator, I'm like, there's a book for everything. But like how beautiful, right? That we do have this tool that is actually like so ancient, right? We have this beautiful gift of storytelling. And like, I think that it's really often under celebrated because of whatever reason, but it is what families, what people did, right? Gather around the fire, gather around the table,
Right.
tell stories. And that's how legends are passed down. That's how, history is passed down. And how beautiful that we don't need any special skill set, right? To do
Right.
that, except just like remember and feel like that's it. Right. And how though that's in that simplicity, we can find such connection
Exactly.
across generations. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing that we do to really cultivate those cultural connections too, and again, it sounds so minor, or I don't know, again, I think we tend to think too big sometimes about cultural connection and but culture are values, culture is relationships, culture is story. And so it doesn't have to be even, big holiday, traditions or differences or these big get-togethers. Something that we do that we really try to do is cultivate or support my daughter's friendships. Friends who we think, share our values and share our background, who, even sometimes working at a dual language school, I find it, if I'm being asset minded, I find it an opportunity. If I'm not in that space, it's a little bit disheartening of here we are in this Spanish immersion program, and we have students who have been learning Spanish and English side by side from 3 on up. And still, by the time they're in middle school, more often than not, those who speak English natively are better friends and hanging out together, and those who speak Spanish natively are closer friends and hanging out together. So it takes work to make those connections. And of course, my daughter has agency, and she is going to also tell us who her best friends are and all that. And she's not the one scheduling the play dates yet, right? And so that's something that we can do to make sure that her friendships, at least the friendships that she has now, don't all look the same, and they're not all the same kinds of families from the same backgrounds. And that's also, like I said, that's how values and story are reproduced. And I think in a much deeper and much more impactful way.
Oh, I love that. And that brings to mind how, we had a friend of one of our daughters who, while my daughters didn't choose to take danza folclórica, they have friends who did, and to like go and support their performances, and be like, it's okay that you didn't choose this, right? But like, how cool that your friends did, and let's go like support them. And something that is really important to them and their family, and so I think you're right. I guess to model, right, for our kids, what our values look like via like our friendships, right, that we choose,
right.
is really valuable. And I think we forget, and sometimes it does. I mean, everything gets so blurry when you're parenting. I just literally feel like I'm in a fog all the time, right?
All the time.
I think like our kids never forget they have agency. And so I think we should sometimes remember we have agency too.
Right.
With regards to, we've been talking about, your journey as a parent, and I'm kind of curious now that like, as you're also an administrator at a dual language school, I'm curious how you support families on this journey, right? Who are raising bilingual kids and maybe either don't speak the language at home or only have one person who speaks the language at home, right? How do you bridge that gap from your experience as a parent to administrator to then supporting those in your community?
That's a great question. I try to support our families in a number of ways. And I think the most important way that I do that is by trying to make sure that I'm not the only one doing it, that they're getting support from teachers, from support staff, from everybody, from the amazing PTO. But I think there's a couple of ways in particular, a couple of, for lack of a better word, narratives that I really try to reproduce, because it can be scary. I think that's the thing that surprised me when I first really entered the dual language space. And the fear that I saw and the surprise that I had just really showed me how, like, my privileged position as being an educator, and like me being confident that like my kid's going to be literate. I know it because I was a literacy teacher. And if her teachers aren't going to do it, I'm going to do it. My kid's going to be fine. that is a really specific experience that not everybody has. So we have a number of families who come in and and I would say the majority of our families are those parents who speak at best, are heritage speakers, and at best they speak Spanglish. Parents spoke Spanish to each other. Maybe they spoke Spanish as a way of like kind of sharing secrets behind their kids' back, right? But like the parent generation is the English dominant, almost English only generation. And their kids now who are in our school, they don't want that for them. So kind of, mirroring my experience. And a lot of our parents come in and they're like, this is what we want. But more than anything, we really just need our kids to be readers. And we need them to be fluent in English. We would love them to be bilingual and biliterate and bicultural, but we're nervous. And we're nervous especially because we don't really understand how language acquisition works. And we're nervous that either, one, our kid, despite being in a Spanish immersion program, is only speaking English rather. So like, what are y'all doing over there? Right? Why are they still only speaking English at home? Or like their kids in first grade, second grade, entering third grade, and they're like, when's the English literacy going to come? Like, where is it? And there's this trepidation that happens there. So it's a lot of like, one way that I support it is just by sharing over and over again, like this is how simultaneous bilingualism and biliteracy work. Or not even simultaneous, but English dominant to Spanish, like, yes, your kid for a few years is probably going to remain English dominant, or has, like in my case, has decided that your home is an English speaking space and you're not going to see that they're speaking fluent Spanish in the classroom, right? And it's hard if you're not an educator to know that the Spanish is going to influence the English, Spanish literacy is going to influence the English literacy, and that the English literacy will come. But that's difficult to see. And it's difficult, especially in third and fourth grade, when we see that there is a English literacy dip in dual language, that compared to their English only peers, they, those in a dual language program often do not perform at the same level because they've been working in Spanish for 4 years. They will catch up, and they do catch up, and then they overtake, right? And they're doing it in 2 languages, which is phenomenal. But as a parent, they're your babies. You don't get a second chance at this, right? That's really scary. And so I just try to, in as many different ways as I can, as often as I can, just to remind parents. I want our parents to be language acquisition experts. And the more that they can become that, I think then the more supportive both they and then the whole community feel. So that's one way that I support. Another way that the school supports biliteracy, by multiculturalism, is really through our family engagement. We recognize the value of culture and the value of connection. And if our students are connecting, our families should be connecting too. And it can't just happen in like, oh, this is like the concert. So you're going to come, you're all going to sit side by side, all looking in the same direction. You're going to listen to your kid. You're only going to listen to your kid, and then you're going to go home. Like, that's great, but that's not true connection. And so we try to create opportunities that are much less structured, where the kids are playing, they're having a great time, but really an opportunity for our families to connect in meaningful and authentic ways. And I think the more that they can do that, the more that they can mutually support one another. And I think that's especially important because dual language isn't a universal value, but ours is a school where everyone is choosing to send their kids there. At the very least, every family member, every parent, every guardian has at least one thing in common. That value of biliteracy, bilingualism, and multiculturalism. So at the very least, they can connect that way. And hopefully that grows into something bigger.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. And I think that sometimes we as parents are the barrier, right? And I think that if we expect our kids to be vulnerable sometimes, which it is, right? To learn a second language and be in an environment where maybe we're asking you to use a language and you haven't really mastered it yet, or you're shy around it. And if we expect our kids to be vulnerable, they also need to see us be vulnerable, right? And maybe making friends with a parent who we haven't met before, or engaging just, across different dynamics that are less comfortable or less familiar is really important as well.
Exactly. If we want our kids to have diverse friendships, and yet they look at the families, the parents that the adults are hanging out with, and they see lack of diversity, we're not modeling for them what we're hoping for them. And so, I mean, kids are observant. They're going to resist that right away. Right. And I think it's a lot more powerful to model that than just to say, do what I say, not what I do. Like that's never going to work with parenting. Right.
Right.
So I think we need to put ourselves out there and cultivate those relationships too.
Yeah. Agreed. Now I have a question for you. I know that I'm totally calling myself out on this, right? That, we know that there's this magic period in early childhood, right? Where it's this really opportune and ripe time for kids to learn things in general, right? We're like laying the foundation. And then, then I think elementary is still just like an extension of that. And I think that a lot of, I've had questions and people reaching out to me and like, okay, well, what do we do in the other stages of development, right? Like, because maybe kids don't get to choose a language in middle school. And so maybe they can't even take Spanish again until high school, right? Like, what does the support of a child, who you want to continue this trajectory of language and bi or multiculturalism, how do we support them in the other stages so that it does continue as this lifelong thing, right? As opposed to this thing I did when I was a kid.
I love that because, if my 6-year-old has agency, talk about a teenager, right? I think two things. One is I've read that same literature that says, okay, right, this, that suggests that early childhood is like the optimal time for language acquisition. And I think in a lot of cases that is true, but not necessarily for the reasons that we think it is. Other literature is saying that it's not that we have, like, if a person has learned language, which the vast majority of us have, right? If you have a language, you can learn a language at any point in your life. The key is how receptive you are to learning it. And that's the tough thing. It is not that necessarily that I'm painting with a broad brush here, right? But it's not necessarily that teenagers are less able to learn another language. What teenagers are is very, very concerned with how they show up and how their peers are judging them. And so the last thing that a teenager wants to do is make a mistake in front of their peers. Kids, on the other hand, young kids, really they haven't internalized that, right? They don't have that effective filter. They'll make mistakes, whatever. Half the time, they're not even aware that they're making a mistake, and they will try and try and try again. And that's how you acquire language. So I think what we have to do, or not have to, but something that we can do to help older students maintain or develop their multilingual journey is really cultivate risk-taking as a young child. Make it safe to take risks, make language learning fun, narrate through story all the reasons why this is important, and it could be, politically, professionally, it could be, individually, familially, whatever, right? I think that early childhood, that's really where we have the opportunity to cultivate that motivation in kids. Because that's really hard to do after the fact. And that's not just from multilingual education. That's for everything, right? Right. If a kid then has an openness, I think, to maintaining the heritage language from elementary school, then if the middle school doesn't offer Spanish, in this case, right, as an elective, and they have 3 years until high school where they might be able to take it up again, well, like this is where, we have the library, like you said, and we're just going to keep reading it, and we're going to schedule our Spanish speaking time, or we're going to have a Spanish speaking group with friends. Maybe your friends from your Spanish immersion or dual language school are all spread out in different middle schools now, but we're going to come together once a week and we're going to speak Spanish together. Something like that. It's once you have the foundation, then I think there's lots of opportunities out there to, at the very least, maintain, and then you can grow it again in high school.
Yeah. And I mean, the whole making it fun thing is so important, right? I think when, as we know, in middle school, kids are going through such big social emotional changes, right? That if it's not appealing, they're not interested.
Oh, yeah.
It does not take priority, right? And so kind of following their interests in order to make it fun is huge. And again, easier said than done, right?
Absolutely.
But definitely worth mentioning that it's hard work, but it's doable. I encourage parents to not give up.
Exactly. I think one thing about Denver is I think Denver really celebrates multilingualism. I think it always has room to improve, but I think Denver celebrates multilingualism, and I think a lot of cities do as well. So, adolescents, teenagers, they have their own interests, of course. But something that I really appreciate about living here is there are a lot of opportunities for teenagers to pursue their interests in languages other than English. So if you have the means, if you're privileged to have the means, you can sign up your kid for like a soccer summer camp that is taught in Spanish or coached in Spanish, for example, or a dance club or whatever. That was certainly not something that I had access to growing up. And yeah, like, a 13-year-old really might not want to sit down and just like do like a Spanish club, like, and just like, and the whole point of the club is to talk in Spanish. Like, that might not be the thing that's really motivating them, but they might really be really into video games. And cool, that's something that we're going to support. Go play video games, whatever. And hey, by the way, it's all in Spanish. So Godspeed, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Like all of parenting, as in so much that you've said, like all of parenting, it's challenging, right? And we have to always find kind of like the workarounds and then always be like adjusting, and I think, what I'm hearing you say is also like lean into the resources that are available. And, most cities, right, most places have some amount of resources, and I think that part of that, I think under the umbrella of resources is finding people, like finding your people, finding your community, right? And, so because I think that another feeling that is often associated with both parenting in general and then again, bilingual parenting is that sometimes it's isolating and it's lonely if you don't have a community. And I mean, that can kind of also just, make you want to give up, right? Or feel like you have to do it all alone. And so while it does take effort to find your people, especially if you're not overly social, it does, help later, right? Because then you have this community and this, these friendships, where you are bolstering each other on this journey.
Exactly. And I think we can think of community really broadly. It doesn't just have to be about, paying quite a bit of money for 1 week during the summer, right? And if you do that every week, tell me how, that's expensive, right? Something that we do in my family too, like there's this super local neighborhood kind of like mom and pop Mexican restaurant that we can walk to. And it's become a really special place for our daughter. We go there fairly regularly to celebrate her when she does something positive or, whatever. But by going there repeatedly, as parents, we have pushed ourselves to get to know the staff and they know our values of bilingualism and all that. And so now this is a place, they now know us and they know that we're like, when we go into that space, it's Spanish only. And they know it's safe for them to like correct our daughter if she's speaking in English. They'll be like, oh, let's try that again. And that's, yes, that's still spending a little bit of money, but like it's buying like a few tacos and a Coke. Like it's not, that's not going to break the bank, but that is, a regular occurrence, a space that is safe for our family to be vulnerable linguistically and provides yet another opportunity for our daughter to make connections, cultural connections and linguistic connections.
Yeah, I love that. Once we start looking, right, there's actually so many opportunities for us to really just kind of be intentional about our lessons, right? And how we're modeling and how we're showing up with our family and with our kids in this world. Well, this has been amazing and I can't believe the time has flown by. I've loved this conversation. I could probably just keep going and going forever.
So could I. Oh my God.
And I do want to end with one, not even specifically language or parenting or educator related question, but just, an individual you question is, can you share with our audience just something that is bringing you joy these days?
My daughter is bringing me a lot of joy these days. As an educator, I get summers off. She has summers off. And so it's a really special time just for the two of us. My partner works year round. And so it's been, that father-daughter time is really, really special. And during the school year as a building co-leader, I see her a lot, but it's not always quality time. So really just having, and sometimes it's something really big. We went on a really big overambitious hike a few days ago, but Also, like, I went to that taco restaurant with her today and she chose to sit on my lap and share her Fanta with me. And that was just so special. And I loved it. So I'm just that's bringing me a lot of joy right now, that special time with her.
I love that. And I love that, right? It comes back, we circle all the way back to connection and how it's so priceless, right? The connection.
Right.
It's beautiful. Thanks for sharing. Well, I do want to just give you the mic one last time. If there's anything else you want to share with families, with listeners, with educators out there. Anything else before we close out?
I just think, I think the last thing that I'll end with, and I am saying this as a human, as a parent, as a former teacher, as a building leader, bilingualism, biliteracy, it is not easy. I think we all know that. There's no such thing as perfect with it. That doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile. It's so worthwhile. And if you're listening, like, you are doing amazing.
Thanks. I think we all need to hear that every once in a while. So appreciate it. I needed to hear that. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been wonderful catching up with you and seeing you again. Thanks for all your hard work in all of the circles you're in. And thank you for all you do and the perspectives that you share. So
thank you so much for having me. This was great. I really appreciated talking about this.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you liked what you heard, take a minute to share this podcast with a friend or colleague. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review on your favorite podcast platform. Your ratings and reviews help us keep the lights on. We can't do this without your support. Every subscription, share, follow, download, and review make a big difference and helps others find us. Also, we love hearing from you. Tell us what you think of the podcast. Email us at hello@bilingualgeneration.com. You can also slide into our DMs on Instagram @talkingtograndma. If you're interested in learning more about our workshops and curricular tools for schools serving multilingual and emerging multilingual students, visit our website at www.bilingualgeneration.com or write us at hello@bilingualgeneration.com. Talking to Grandma is owned by Bilingual Generation. The artwork for Talking to Grandma was created by Nancy Guevara. Jenn Vargas-Pressman is the co-host of this show. And I'm Rebecca De Leon, editor, producer, and co-host. See you in the next episode.